Hi, I'm Caroline Levitt. I'm the co-founder of the Mighty Blaze, the book initiative that was begun during the pandemic to help authors whose tours had been canceled, independent bookstores, and readers. We have a really, really special Mighty Blaze today. We have Jennifer Haigh with us. I want to show you this gorgeous cover, which we're going to talk about, Mercy Street, which is just a beautiful book. I was talking to Jennifer before we got on here, and I mentioned to her that I remember where her first book, the Three Mrs. Kimmells, and how amazing it was and how in awe I was. So let me just give her an introduction and then we'll start to talk. Jennifer Haigh is the author of the highly acclaimed novels Mrs. Kimball, Baker Towers, The Condition, Faith, and Hidden Life, and a book of short stories, News from Heaven. Her books have won the Penn Hemingway Award, the Massachusetts Book Award, the Penn New England Award in Fiction, and have been published in 18 languages. She's a Guggenheim Fellow, and she won a Literature Award from the American Academy of Arts and Letters. Her new novel, Mercy Street, has just been published. It's about the interconnecting lives of people in and out of a Boston abortion clinic during the blizzard season of 2016. It's already racking up the raves. In fact, it got 2 rave New York Times reviews in one day. First one was from the wonderful Richard Russo, who said this book is wonderfully entertaining, boasting a large, varied cast of vividly drawn characters whose company readers will find deeply rewarding, in no small part because lurking in the shadows is the devastatingly wry humor of the creator. That's great. And if that's not great enough, here's one from Janet Maslin. Um, Jennifer Haigh sketches characters whose interests are at cross purposes, but whose deep-seated deprivation binds them together. Her 2016 Hidden Light, torpedoed by its I don't agree with this. Torpedoed by its nominal subject. I don't agree with that at all. But then they say it was a small town epic on the order of Richard Russo's Empire Falls. Mercy Street takes on much more fiery issues. Abortion, guns, vigilantism, drug dealing, white supremacy, misogyny, all figure in the tableau Haigh expertly details. And I want to say also that this is a wonderful, wonderful character drawn book. It's about people and it's about situations. So before we start, I want to say welcome, Jennifer. I'm so thrilled to have Jennifer Haigh here.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here.
So I want to tell everybody out there, please buy Jennifer's book at an independent bookstore. You can find one near you if you go to bookshop.org. Mighty Blaze has their own bookshelf there, or you can just walk down the street to your favorite bookstore. All right, so I want to talk about this book. I feel that knowledge is always power, and being able to live through characters, even ones you may not agree with, can illuminate everyone's life and help create a more human and humane society. There's very, very different people in this book. There's Claudia, who works at the abortion clinic. There's Victor, who's totally against it. We get to inhabit Deb, Claudia's mother. There's Anthony, who's disabled. How do you go about, what I love so much is that it seemed like you started with one character, which was Claudia, and then she sort of branched out, and we got to know all these other characters, and gradually the characters put out feelers and had connections. Was all this planned before you started writing?
No, I never write that way. I never have been able to. I know writers who outline a whole book chapter by chapter and then just sort of execute the plan. And I've always envied those people. I tried to do that once, and I spent 3 or 4 months. I wrote a great outline of a novel. It took me months to do this. It was very detailed. It would have been a great book. But by the time I'd outlined the whole thing, I thought, well, I don't need to write this thing. I feel like I already wrote it.
Right.
As a writer, I think I write for the same reasons I read novels, and that's to find out what happens. And so when I start writing something, I really don't know everything that's going to happen. At most, I know maybe like one event that I'm writing toward. And that's kind of the thing that gets me started. But I certainly never know the ending. And in fact, the few times I've thought I did know the ending, I get to that point and I find out I'm dead wrong, because what happens is after you've lived with the characters for 2 or 3 years, you know them so well that you understand, well, okay, he wouldn't do that. She wouldn't say
Right.
that. That would never happen. It's not psychologically true. So at the beginning, when the characters are just sketches, you don't know them well enough to know how they would behave in different situations. It's only by writing them, week after week, month after month, that they become real enough that you can predict how they would behave in these situations. So
That's
anytime I
right.
have a preconceived idea of the ending, I know it's probably wrong.
Yeah, I always have at least 10 different endings. And I want to sort of dovetail back to something we were talking about in our virtual green room, which is openings and beginnings. Mercy Street, I want to show the gorgeous cover again. Oops. Mercy Street has this incredible first line, which to me had so many layers to it. It was, it's hard to ever know where a story begins.
Mm.
As soon as I saw that, as I told you, I thought that's a writer's line because we never know, we never know what is the right place to start our story. And in this case, it's the character who is trying to figure out, how to tell her story. But I wanted to know, how did this story begin for you personally? And
Mm.
what did you know you wanted to write this?
Okay, so this novel kind of grew out of an experience I had some years ago, volunteering at a clinic that was very much like the clinic in the
Mhm.
book. And in my time there, I was mainly working on a hotline. I was answering calls on the hotline at this clinic. A lot of the callers, not all of them, but maybe a third of them were women calling to schedule abortions. People called for other reasons too. They called to make appointments, to get birth control pills, to get pelvic exams, to, get annual checkups, that kind of thing. But I would say at least a third of them were calling to schedule abortions. And I started volunteering there because I believed in the work they did. I thought it was a really important thing to support. I had no intention of writing about it. And I don't know that I ever would have done. But in the time I spent there, I learned so much. And it so amplified my understanding of what this experience of abortion is and why people have them. And and I realize these are things that most people don't know. Even people who believe in abortion rights often don't know very much about abortion itself. And that is because most women who've had an abortion don't feel free to talk honestly about it. Um,
Right.
in fact, 1 in 4 American women will at some point in her life have an abortion. That's a ton of people. It's
Yeah,
such
it
a
is.
common experience that every one of us knows someone who had an abortion. Even if we don't know, we know. She may never tell you about this for obvious reasons, but we all know somebody who's been through this experience, and yet it is kind of shrouded in mystery. And so, one of the things I wanted to do in this book was shed some light on that, on how this happens, what this experience means in different people's lives. Um, and I can tell you, even the moment I knew I was going to write about this, and I'd been volunteering there for quite a while, there was a woman who called to schedule an abortion. And like some of the callers, she wanted to talk a little bit about her reasons for doing it. Not everybody wants to talk about it. A lot of women who called were very matter of fact. They had, figured it out for themselves. They were clear on their decisions, and they just wanted to get the thing scheduled. Fine. But this caller wanted to talk about it. And what she told me was, I need to have an abortion because if my ex finds out I'm pregnant, he'll come to my house and shoot my kids.
Oh my God.
Yeah. And so, I of course I don't know this woman. I can't say for certain whether she was being paranoid or whether she was correct. I have no way of knowing. I'm just a stranger on the hotline, but I am inclined to believe her.
I
And
am
I
inclined to
really,
believe
of
her
course,
too.
women are the best judges of what is best for them, and what is going on in their lives. And what I came away from that experience understanding is that no one will ever know all the factors that lead into someone making this choice. And so it's just arrogant for anyone else to think, whether it's people coming from a political point of view or a religious point of view. It's just sheer arrogance to think you know better than the woman herself does what decision she should make. So that was sort of the moment where I thought, okay, I am going to have to write about this. And I was deeply ambivalent about writing it, I will tell you, and remained ambivalent about it pretty much the whole way through. It's a hard thing to write about, and it's a harder thing to publish because you do kind of feel that you're opening yourself up to all kinds of crazy, to people's reactions. And people are very adamant on this subject on both sides. And,
Right.
Yeah.
But I was going to say, because this book is so character driven and you've explored everybody's feelings around this topic so beautifully, I think in a way it allows readers to live another life that they might not have lived in their own way. Like we get to live through Victor, who is total misogynist, white supremacist, but we come to understand why he's that way and what forces are driving him and what he wants. And there's a big thrumming question through this novel, I think, which has to do with wanting what everybody wants and what they're trying to do to feel wanted, and what they want has a price. There's like Timmy, who needs to sell weed to pay for child support. And if weed is legalized, which most people agree is good, will be a good thing, it's not going to be a good thing for him, because how is he going to have enough money to support his kid? Anthony is disabled and he's living his life online. He wants to matter in the real world, but if he's not in the real world, how can he do that? So the way that he tries to matter is a way that many people would see as not a good way. But because you've created these characters so beautifully, we understand it. Maybe we don't want to be friends with Tim or friends with Victor, but you come to deeply understand the characters. So this is leading to a question. The question is, how do you develop your characters? And did you know who these people were when you started? Or did they sort of reveal themselves to you?
Oh, the characters become themselves in the process of writing them. At the beginning, just the tiniest bit about any character, and they all change in the process of writing. So, I knew a little bit, but it's this process of accretion. It's over weeks and months and years that the characters become people.
Okay. You've also written about controversy before. With Faith, it was really brave book about abuse in the church. Heat and Light was about fracking. And again, I think you do it through character. But what draws you to stories like these? And do you personally have any faith that will ever come to an answer on issues like these? Because these things are still going on in the church, and fracking and abortion issues.
It's a mischaracterization of me as a writer. I don't write issue books, and those three novels are kind of easily distilled in that way. But that isn't why I wrote them. I didn't write them because I had convictions about fracking. That wasn't the reason I wrote that book. I wrote Heat and Light because I have convictions about that place. So that book is set in a part of the world that is dear to me. I'd written 2 earlier books set there. It's a little coal mining town in Western Pennsylvania that is very much modeled on the town where I grew up. It's Western Appalachia. And I've been writing about this place for 20 years. I never intended to write a book about fracking. What happened was, after having written 2 books there, I thought, well, I've said everything there is to say about this little town. The town is on its last legs. Nothing else is ever going to happen there. And in a way, I felt relief that, I'm released from writing about this place that is so heartbreaking to me, and I can write about somewhere else. But then when the fracking story came along, I kind of felt I had to write it, because something else, there was this kind of unexpected third act for this part of the world that I'd kind of given up for dead. And so, it was because I had convictions about the place that I wrote that book. Whatever was happening in that part of the world, I probably would have ended up writing a novel about it.
Okay.
Yeah.
I want to talk about. We were talking a little bit about this before. Whoops! I love this cover. It just, as all writers know, and probably readers too, because readers are attracted by covers. But for writers, a lot of times you go through 20 covers before you find the right one because they're marketing decisions, and so are titles. And I think this particular book, the title Mercy Street is perfect, and the cover is just talk about the cover, how the cover came to be, because it's just
Mm.
perfect. I think.
I love the cover of this book. I think it's exactly right. And, it communicates so much about what the book is. This clinic where I volunteered was really I think, the most diverse, integrated space I'd ever encountered in the city of Boston. Because really, these experiences of needing contraception, sometimes needing an abortion, this happens to women from every walk of life, women of all ages, of all backgrounds, of different races, of different cultures. This is just part of life. It's part of being a woman, of living in a female body. And I think the cover really conveys that, because you do have women of different colors. Of course, they're
Right.
blue and pink and purple, so as not to be too literal, but it really does convey that profound truth about this clinic,
Right.
that it served all kinds of women at all different junctures in their lives. So it's part of the reason that the cover resonated so deeply with me. The other thing I love about it, and I don't know if you can tell it by looking, but the paper dolls on the cover, they were
Right.
actually all cut out of construction paper. This was not made on Photoshop. Alison Saltzman,
Oh.
the art director at Echo, actually sat at her desk and cut out these paper dolls. And if you look at their heads, you can see they're not perfectly smooth. They're like a little bag
That's right. Look at that
on
one
the
right there.
scissors. And
That's
and
right.
so
That's
I
right.
love that it really is a handmade thing. But also these figures, you might not recognize this. What they are is the pictogram you sometimes see on a women's restroom, that outline of a figure in a dress. You know,
That's right.
that's what
That's
these
right. I
figures
didn't
are.
realize that. That's
That's what they
perfect.
are. So it's
That's
really
perfect.
a brilliant idea and so wonderfully executed. And I think Allison knocked it out of the park. I love this cover.
The cover is great. I love the cover too. I also love that some of the figures are actually coming into the letters,
Yeah.
hiding the street, hiding that. It's just it makes it very, very alive. Can you talk about the word mercy and
Mm.
how it relates to the novel and what your thought process was? And
Well, I have a hard time with titles. I always agonize over them, and this was no exception. I agonized over this title too. Where I found it ultimately was in this Anne Sexton poem that is the epigraph for the book. Anne Sexton, who was a Boston poet, wrote this poem about, in her dream, she's wandering the streets of the Back Bay in Boston, asking strangers, "Where's Mercy Street?" And everybody tells her, "Not here, not here." And it's a beautiful, evocative poem. And it also made me think about this idea of mercy, which I define as being able to show empathy and compassion for people, whether they're lovable or not, whether they seem to deserve these things or not.
right.
And for Claudia, who's a counselor at this clinic, mercy is her entire job description. The women that she is caring for are not always lovable. Some of them are. Some of them are charming and brilliant and accomplished, and some of them are very unpleasant. And a lot of them are in extreme situations and desperate and really hard to love. And yet, Claudia is able to find compassion and find ways of caring for these women. So mercy seemed to me exactly the right word.
It is exactly the right word. I also want to talk in terms about setting this book in Boston and during a snowstorm. I grew up in Boston, so I remember the snowstorms very well. Um, why did you set it the year you set it, and with all the snow around? And I think I know the answer, but I'm curious to hear what you're going to say.
Well, you might know the answer. It's a long answer. It's got a lot of parts to it. So, as far as the snow, it's almost the main character in the book. This is set in the winter of 2015, what we in Boston remember fondly as the snowpocalypse. And like everybody who lived here that year, I have PTSD from that winter. I will never
Oh my
recover
God.
from it. And in fact, this winter, when the first snow started falling, I had this horrible kind of anxious memory of that time. And I grew up in Northern Appalachia. I know for winter, I'm not afraid of snow, but that winter broke me, and it did many, many people in Boston. So that experience was so seminal. I felt driven to write about it. I'm sure lots of other people have written about it too. Um, but I think the snow in this book, it sort of it intensifies this feeling of being isolated. And it really did. You know, people were, it was almost like the pandemic before the pandemic in a way. People were kind of trapped in place. We were sheltering in place. You couldn't go anywhere. The tea wasn't running. Um, and it seemed correct for these characters, who are all four of them very isolated people. Claudia and Timmy, who was her weed dealer and, you know, in many ways her closest friend. This guy, Anthony, who also buys weed from Timmy, who is, as you said, has been disabled. He was working on the big dig and was in a construction accident. And so he's living in his mother's basement at age 40, and he's a totally isolated person who lives most of his life online. And finally, Victor Prime, who's kind of the antagonist, Claudia. We haven't talked about him yet. But he's also a very isolated guy.
Right.
So, you know, that feeling we all had during the snowstorm, that feeling of isolation and being trapped, I think all these people experience that in their lives anyway. And it's only amplified by the presence of this snow. So that's the first part of my answer. The second part, why Boston? This book is very much of Boston because Boston is arguably the most Catholic city in America. It still is, even though a lot has happened. So after 2002, when the clergy sex abuse scandal broke in Boston, the church here has never been the same. Church attendance has dropped off sharply. It's never coming back up. A lot of parishes have closed or merged with other parishes. The Boston Archdiocese has been through a lot and is still going through it, and has lost the faith and confidence of an awful lot of people here in this very Catholic town. And that's something I feel very deeply. I grew up Catholic. I went to 12 years of Catholic school. I wrote a whole novel about clergy sex abuse in Boston, as you mentioned, my novel Faith. So this is a story that is meaningful to me, that I've been paying attention to for a lot of years. And it is significant that Mercy Street, the clinic, is located in Boston, and that the protesters outside the clinic are very often Catholic clergy. When the book opens, it's Ash Wednesday, it's the first day of Lent, and most of the protesters on that day are either Franciscan monks or archdiocesan priests. And I find that ironic because the church in Boston has really lost all credibility in sexual matters, let's be honest, after the scandal. And yet, still, you know, on this day, those are the people who are out protesting in front of this abortion clinic, these, you know, presumably celibate men. So there is a comment buried in that answer. And there's a comment buried in this book. It's, you know, it's not a story that could just as easily have happened anywhere. No, it really did have to happen in Boston.
That's perfect. We were talking before we came on here about the whole issue of what does it mean to want a child, and what does it mean for a child to be wanted, which comes out from Claudia's really fierce upbringing with her mother, where not only did she not feel particularly wanted, but she was in charge of helping the fosters that her mother took. And I had this feeling that how we are raised as women really impacts how we feel about having kids or wanting them or raising them. And I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit.
Sure. Well, certainly everything that you say is true of Claudia. So Claudia grew up in basically rural poverty. She grew up in a trailer in rural Maine. She was born to a single mother who got pregnant at age 17 and dropped out of high school in order to have her baby. And that choice she made really determined a lot of what Claudia's life was like. One of the ways her mother, Deb, made ends meet was taking in foster kids. So at any given point, Claudia had, you know, 2 or 3 or 4 foster siblings, younger kids that her mother had taken in, that Claudia was mainly responsible for looking after since her mother was always working. And that experience of growing up in a foster family really informed all Claudia's feelings about what family is, what motherhood is, and also what life looks like for kids who are not necessarily wanted or planned,
Right.
not necessarily born to mothers who are ready to be parents. And so, Claudia's choice to make a career of working at Mercy Street has everything to do with where and how she was raised.
Exactly, exactly. The book also deals a whole lot with issues of class.
Mm.
And one of the biggest arguments in, at least for me, in the whole abortion issue is that if Roe versus Wade does not pass in June, wealthy women will still be able to get safe abortions. Poor women, it's going to be a whole lot harder for them. Or people in low level jobs. This unfairness seemed to create to me, it seemed to create a character like Victor, who feels that he's sort of swirling down the drain, and the only way he can sort of pull himself up is to blame others. He blames women, and he blames women for because he says they're not having. He really believes that they're not having enough children, so that people of color are taking over white people. Totally racist. He he just is a total racist and all of that. Oh, I'm so sorry. I thought I took that off. Sorry. So I wanted to know, in terms of class, how do we get around that? A part of it I thought was why
Well,
the
let me
so
stop you right
important.
there, Caroline. We don't get around it.
Okay,
So I think everything I've ever written is about class. Every novel, every novel, certainly, and many of my short stories too, have to do with questions of class. And that is because of where and how I was raised. I write about working class people, and not that many writers of literary fiction do, because not that many writers of literary fiction come from that sort of background. We don't really choose our subjects, our subjects choose us. So
that's
this
right.
question of class is in everything I write. You really see at the clinic how class impacts the range of options open to women in terms of childbearing. Some of the patients at the clinic who come for abortions are from very comfortable backgrounds. There's one teenage girl who goes to prep school who's in the process of applying to colleges and trying to decide between Princeton and Dartmouth
Right,
when
right,
she gets unexpectedly pregnant. And when she schedules her abortion, her mother comes with her to the clinic, signs the consent form, is very supportive, and even confides to Claudia that she herself had an abortion when she was around the same age as her daughter is now. And you compare that to another patient, her name is Shannon, whom Claudia counsels.
right,
She's a homeless heroin addict, and her pregnancy is detected when she overdoses on heroin in a gas station restroom, and somebody finds her. They take her to the emergency room and do an ultrasound, and that's how she learns that she is pregnant. So what an unplanned pregnancy means for this woman, Shannon, versus this girl, Hannah, who's the prep school girl, it's a wildly different thing. And
right.
the consequences of an unplanned pregnancy are so much more dire for women who don't have resources to begin with, who are not financially stable, not emotionally stable, not in good health, don't have family support, don't have partners. And that describes many, many of the women who come to the clinic to end pregnancies.
I wanted to talk about one of the parts of the book which I absolutely love is when Claudia gets this book, Growing Up and Liking It. I have that book somewhere that my mother gave me when I was, and it's very much a book of its time. It's like totally dated, but the details about that and her learning about, periods and getting pregnant and all that stuff were so much of its time. So I was wondering, did you do research, and what was surprising about your research? What was fun about your research? And what did you learn that sort of stopped you in your tracks, if anything?
Oh, it's so interesting. I tend to do a lot of research for my novels. This is the first one where I've done virtually none. The only
Wow.
Virtually none. In part because so much of the book came out of my own experience of volunteering at this clinic, and
Okay.
was inspired by what I saw and heard. The one bit of research I did do, and it did kind of lead me down a rabbit hole, was developing the character of Victor Prine, who lives a lot of his life online and has found real community online. on 4chan and 8chan. And these were worlds I knew nothing about before I started writing this book. But in order to write Victor, I had to learn a lot about those worlds. I should talk a bit about Victor.
Yeah.
So he is Claudia's antagonist in the novel. He is an anti-abortion activist. He is a Vietnam vet. He is a former long-distance trucker. And what he is mainly doing in his retirement from trucking is building these homemade anti-abortion signs that he then places on public land or by the side of the road in people's yards. That's what he's doing with his time now in his retirement. And that character is very much a product of the place where I grew up, the landscape that is familiar to me, Northern Appalachia. And in fact, Victor is from that same town, Bakerton, where a few of my earlier books are set. It's the location of Baker Towers and Heat and Light, and also the setting of most of the stories in News from Heaven. So it's a part of the world I know very well. And Victor is a person I know very well. I feel like I've known Victor my whole life. Not his sort of, hidden online activities or his misogyny or his racism. That's all invented and imagined. But his exterior, how he functions in the world, how he conducts himself, these signs that he builds, this is all very familiar to me. The little town where I grew up in Pennsylvania, when I was a kid, it was very common to see those anti-abortion signs on the roadside, and they're still there. I mean, that hasn't changed. Those people are still building those signs and putting up those signs. And so creating the character of Victor was really, in a lot of ways, not that difficult, because at least in his exterior, he's very familiar to me. His inner life, I certainly had to invent and fill in. But on the surface, anyway, he's really quite familiar.
He was a great character. He was really alive and multidimensional, and it sort of, expanded my understanding of why someone would feel the way that he felt, which I was really grateful for. I wanted to ask you, do you feel, this is another writer question, do you feel when you finish the book and you go on to the next book that you're taking lessons you've learned from writing the previous book with you, or is every book a brand new thing? Never. Oh, I'm so glad. I'm so glad to hear that.
This is one of my chief complaints about being a writer. I feel so deceived because after I wrote my first novel, I thought, well, okay, now I know how to write a novel, and it's going to be way easier. And what I discovered was, I knew how to write a novel, but only that one novel. And almost nothing I learned in writing Mrs. Kimball was portable. It did not apply to Baker Towers. And that has continued to be the case. Every time you feel like you're starting at zero and you know nothing. And here I am, this is my 7th book, and I still have that feeling. And
I love it.
You're always starting at zero.
I totally love that. When you're writing, it's very reassuring to all writers out there. Very reassuring. So, do you show your writing to people when you're working, or do you have a tested reader, or do you wait until it goes to your agent? How do you know if you're on the right track? Do you just have a feeling inside?
It's really difficult because I'm extremely secretive about what I'm writing. I don't tell anybody what I'm writing while I'm writing it. And I don't show work to anybody until I have a first draft, and sometimes not even until I have a second draft. I need to get through the story at least once, beginning to end, because I need to know what I think about it before I want to, be distracted by what somebody else thinks about it. It really muddies the water for me. So I show nobody my first draft. Usually my second draft, I will send to my reader. And my first line reader is a guy who was a classmate of mine at the Iowa Writers Workshop. He's also a novelist. His name is Dan Pope. And he has been my first line reader for, 22 years almost.
Oh, that's great.
I show him everything, novels, short stories, everything I write. And he shows me everything he writes. And I feel like we've taught each other how to write in many ways.
What writing advice would you give your younger self?
unplug the phone is the first bit of
I
writing advice.
know. I'm so sorry. I
Okay,
usually
it's
am
funny. I like it.
so.
I just love it that you have a landline. I haven't had a landline in so
No,
many years.
we have a landline because my husband does interviews that he needs to tape on the phone, audio ones, and I'm usually so good about this. And I'm the first person in a movie theater if someone has a phone on where I'm standing up
You're that
and yelling
person.
at.
Okay.
Okay, comic relief, all on me. So anyway, the question I wanted to ask you was, what what question? I mean, what advice would you give yourself as a Runga writer?
Wow, no one's ever asked me that before, and I think that's a really good question. I would say to be audacious. It's not something that I was raised to be. I think a lot of women were not raised to be. I'd like to think maybe that's changing generationally, and younger women don't feel quite as inhibited in that regard as I did growing up. But if you're a good Catholic schoolgirl, you are not raised for audacity, and
Right, that's right.
at all, at all,
That's
at
right.
all. And so that's the advice I would give myself, is to be brave.
Okay. And I always ask this question because I always want to know the answer. What's obsessing you now and why?
What's obsessing me? What do you mean?
It can be anything. It can be some people answer that they're obsessed with knowing how to make the perfect spaghetti. Other people say, well, they're obsessed with, you know, a political issue. Some people are obsessed with the pandemic. I guess this just shows that I have an obsessive personality, so I'm always obsessed with things.
Yeah, what's
So I'm always
obsessing
curious
you?
about
I'm
what
gonna turn that question back at you. What's obsessing you?
what's obsessing me, why I can't knit a sweater that is going to fit perfectly. That's like, I will rip it out and go back in it. I just, I have what's called a busy brain, so that's why that question is there.
Oh my God, you're such a novelist. That is such a novelist response to knitting. You're just constantly revising.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
like, yeah, that's exactly what it is. Rip it out and start with it all over again.
Mhm, mhm.
Um, would you consider reading something for us for a few
Yeah.
minutes?
Oh,
Oh,
right.
great. I would love it. Thank you so
Okay.
much. And
I'm not
all
gonna
my
read.
phones are turned off, by the
Okay.
way, so no fear.
All right. I'm not going to read too long because I know on Zoom that can get tedious, but I'm going to read a short section, very short, from the first chapter of Mercy Street. And this is, in fact, the first scene of the book. Claudia is at work, and she is looking out a second-story window at the protesters outside the clinic. On a frigid Wednesday morning in mid-February, a crowd gathered in front of the clinic, their backs to Mercy Street. Claudia stood at a second-floor window in the staff kitchen, counting heads. 36, she said. Seen from above, the group looked organized. They stood in concentric circles like the growth rings of a tree. In the center were the professionals, archdiocesan priests in slick nylon dress slacks, a few monks from the Franciscan monastery in New Bedford, the tails of their brown robes peeking out from beneath winter coats. In the outer rings were the regular people, holding rosary beads or carrying signs. Did you count those guys in pack? Mary, the nurse practitioner, asked. A few lurkers stood at the margins, staring at cell phones like bored strangers at a bus stop. Whether they were protesters or indifferent bystanders was impossible to say. No, said Claudia. I wasn't sure about them. 36, she felt, was a sizable number. In their bulky coats, they might have been carrying anything. There were 12 staff working at the clinic, except for Luis, the security guard, all female, all unarmed.
That's wonderful. That's absolutely wonderful. It's do you read your work out loud after you've written it? You
Oh,
do.
always,
Yeah, me too, me too. But
always.
it's you can tell because a lot of times when writers stand up and they read in bookstores, sometimes there's what I call the authorial voice, where it sounds like they're pausing too dramatically. But your reading was like telling a story. It was very organic and very beautiful. I have one more question for you, which is how are you balancing your writing life and your being out there in promotional life and just your life with friends and family during the pandemic? Has that gotten easier for you? I guess I want advice.
Well, right now I'm not balancing it at all because having a book come out is not conducive to writing. And so the
Right.
book only came out, 3 days ago, 4 days ago. And I'm not writing at the moment and probably won't be able to for a little while. It's kind of like, it's hard to talk about the last thing you wrote and still be engaged in something new. It's kind of like you fall
Yes.
in love with someone new and then your bad old ex-boyfriend starts calling again. That's what it's like when you have to go talk about the
Right.
last thing you wrote. And so, I kind of can't do both at the same time, and I'm allowing myself to not do both at the same time. I am also teaching this semester, which is not normal for me. I'm teaching in the MFA Creative Writing program at UMass Boston and really enjoying that. That I'm able to do while promoting a book, but to additionally be able to write as well, that's just beyond me. I'm really not a very good juggler at all. Normally I do one thing at a time. And normally I
Yeah.
don't teach, I'm just writing. And that's my natural state, sitting alone.
It's very hard. It's very, very hard. I want to show this gorgeous cover again. Mercy Street by Jennifer Haigh. This is one of my favorite books of the year, and Jennifer is actually one of my favorite authors of all time. I encourage everybody, please go to your local independent bookstore, or you can go to bookshop.org, or you can go to your favorite indie bookstore online and buy any of Jennifer's books. Are wonderful, and if you buy this one, then you get this gorgeous cover. I want to thank everybody who showed up here. I also want to thank Jennifer so much. This was so much fun. And I want to apologize to everybody about my phones being on. And I swear I won't happen again. So, Jennifer, if you can just stay on for a minute, and everybody else, I'm going to say goodbye, and we'll see you next time. Bye.